Hello, I'm Hailey from We Learn to Share, and this lecture is going to be about the Treaty of Versailles. Now, before we begin, let me just briefly introduce myself because this is my first lecture on WLTS. So I'll be creating lectures such as this, sharing my knowledge on GCSE History and also SAT English, so please stay tuned for more lectures regarding these subjects. So let's just get straight to the point and begin. The Treaty of Versailles is the first topic that you'll encounter in GCSE History, and it's also the most crucially important as everything else that you'll learn throughout the course is all circulated down to this particular topic. For example, Topic 2 of GCSE History is the League of Nations, which is actually derived from the conferences that negotiated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. We'll actually talk about this today. And also Topic 3 is the collapse of international peace, and it deals with the way that Hitler tried to terminate the terms of the treaty stemmed from the discontent of the German public, which we'll also briefly look at today, and so and so. So, we've established that this is actually a very important treaty in the course of history, so let's just get straight to the key question, which is what was the Treaty of Versailles? The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that marked the official end of World War I, and it was signed by Germany and the Allied nations on June 28, 1919. Just giving you a bit of background knowledge on the First World War, it was a bid by the Central Powers such as Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria to dominate Europe. In 1918, the Allies won the war against these Central Powers, and this led to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The three most prominent attendees of the Versailles Conference was Britain, USA, and France, and we'll look at all three of the nations and their leaders and what they actually wanted for the treaty because as it all happens in global politics and international relations, they all had different desires and outcomes that they wanted for the Treaty of Versailles. These three leaders, the three leaders of these three nations are collectively referred to as the Big Three, which we'll constantly mention throughout this lecture. And yeah, we'll just get straight to looking into what each of these leaders wanted. So the first leader we'll mention is Georges Clemenceau. Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France, and his primary concern was to guarantee the security of France against Germany. Thus, he wanted punishment that was as punitive as possible to the extent that Germany would never be able to recover from their loss again. Basically, he just wanted to cripple Germany severely. So, although this may seem like extreme conditions, this paranoia was completely justified, as France had suffered the most damage to its land, industry, people, and self-confidence. Over 2/3 of the French army were killed or wounded, and the German army had caused deliberate damage when retreating across northeastern France. Not only this, France shared a direct border with Germany, which wasn't clearly defined with a natural frontier such as rivers or mountains. This made them incredibly vulnerable to German attacks. Perhaps it was because of this, but German troops had invaded France 2 times in 50 years during the war. By now, you should be able to predict how severe the hatred of Germany was in France. So there was a natural hatred and a desire for revenge against Germany in France, and Clemenceau sought to satisfy these ambitions of the French public at the Versailles Conference. So the French demands stemmed from this discontent were as follows. First of all, they wanted permanent disarmament of Germany, so that Germany would not have the adequate armaments or manpower to attempt any further acts of aggression in the future. And they also wanted to secure that they won't be able to recover and they won't be able to build up their armaments again even after the Versailles Treaty was formed, so that they would never be able to reacquire their status as a very prominent actor and prominent power in the international arena again. Secondly, they wanted very high reparations for similar reasons. They wanted to devastate the German economy beyond repair so that, again, they would be crippled. And third, they wanted the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France. Alsace-Lorraine was territory that was invaded by Germany in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. So basically, they wanted this territory back that they knew that belonged to them in the first place. And fourth, they wanted the Rhineland to become an independent state. The Rhineland was a very industrial area, which was very valuable to the Germans in terms of boosting their economy, and it would contribute towards the French desire to cripple Germany economically. Not only this, it would also mean that France would no longer share a border with Germany, because that was kind of like the frontier where Germany and France was divided. So France would get two gains from this term. Firstly, they would be able to secure their, national security, because their frontier would be kind of be divided by an independent state if Rhineland were to become an independent state, and also it would be able to contribute to their ambitions of kind of crippling Germany to the extent that they won't be able to recover again. So as you can already see from these demands, Clemenceau was very tough and uncompromising, and he held a belief towards an extremely stern and harsh form of justice. He believed that this was the way to do it, and if this was not going to be the case, if harsh terms would not be imposed on Germany, they would just simply recover and do more acts of aggression and invade France again and start another war. So these were Clemenceau and France's This was Clemenceau and France's stance, and we'll see that it kind of differs a lot from the other leaders and what they think about the treaty. However, the USA had disagreed with Clemenceau's methods of severely punishing Germany and forcing peace with harsh terms. The US had actually had a very different perception of the war compared to France, as first of all, they had not joined the war until later, so there was a shorter amount of time that they were actually involved in the war, and their civilian fatalities did not exceed 800 people. So American territory was never invaded, unlike France, and the US had actually made a sizable profit with increments in trading and business opportunities concerning war materials. Thus, they could say with confidence and with ease that they wanted a long-term sustainable international peace, and they could take a detached perspective, unlike France. So Woodrow Wilson was the president of the USA at the time, and he devised 14 points to help the international community achieve such a peace. So we won't mention all 14 points, but just to mention the most prominent terms. First of all, he advocated no secret treaties because he believed that increasing secrets between nations increased animosity between them and also eroded trust in the international community. And also he wanted free navigation of the seas because he thought that the seas did not exactly belong to any nation, so they could use it freely when trading with other countries, or just in general the seas would be out of bounds for any nation. And third, he wanted reduction of armaments for all countries because he believed that armaments were the key cause of animosity and increasing aggression and basically war, and that it challenged peace. And fourth of all, he wanted German troops to leave Russia because, as we have established, he was very against aggression. And also he wanted independence for Belgium, self-determination for people of Austria-Hungary and the Turkish Empire, because he believed that autonomy and self-determination was very important to secure the long-term stability of Europe itself. Also, he wanted the establishment of an independent Poland with access to the sea. Again, the key term independent is used because he wanted autonomy and self-determination. And also he wanted an establishment of a League of Nations where nations would settle disputes with diplomatic methods instead of using aggression and conflict as they had done in the past. And he wanted to mitigate aggression and work towards international peace collectively as a group of nations working together. So inevitably, these idealistic terms of Wilson's 14 points clashed heavily with Clemenceau's demands for total destruction of the German economy and land. This difference in opinion made it extremely difficult for the leaders to come to a consensus in the Versailles conferences. Caught in between these tensions between Wilson and Clemenceau was Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time. Britain had also sustained heavy casualties exceeding 1 million, and the British mainland was directly affected during the war in incidents such as the bombardment of Yorkshire coastal towns and the Zeppelin raids of 1915 to 18. Also, their economy, especially the export sector, was severely damaged. This led to consequences similar to France in the national public, because the British public were also extremely hateful of Germany, as France had, and so the British demands were for Germany to pay for the whole cost of the war and take the whole blame for the war itself, and for Britain to receive most of the German colonies. However, Lloyd George was in two minds. First of all, he did want severe punishment such as Clemenceau wanted, because the British public itself had demanded vengeance, and Lloyd George needed votes and needed to secure his popularity for the 1918 election. However, he knew that the future well-being of British economy itself depended on the revival of the German economy. Because Germany was a very important trade customer at the time, if Germany had, for example, lost the Rhineland, it would not be wealthy enough to buy British goods, and thus British economy would be heavily affected as well. Also, very high reparations, as Clemenceau wanted, and also as the British public had wanted, would alter German economy too much so that they won't be able to recover and be a prominent customer to British goods again. Also, he thought that an overly harsh treaty would lead to German outrage and attempts to overthrow its terms. On top of everything, he also wanted Germany to act as a barrier against the spread of communism from the East, which was a big deal at the time. So Lloyd George held quite a nuanced and detached view compared to the other two leaders. Although he was in two minds, he knew how to balance these two so that he could get the best outcome and the best terms of the treaty that would kind of play to his advantages most. And thus he acted as a buffer to persuade both leaders, both Wilson and Clemenceau, to come to a consensus on several issues, while cleverly manipulating the situation to be rendered according to his own ambitions. For example, he persuaded Clemenceau to abandon the idea of making the Rhineland as an independent state, as was his concerns in the two minds that he had, that if Germany had lost the Rhineland, then British economy would be faltered as well. Like such, it is often mentioned that Lloyd George was the most satisfied among the big three because he knew how to play his cards, he knew how to balance the seemingly polarized ambitions of Wilson and Clemenceau to get the exact medium that would give him the best outcome for himself and Britain as well. So we've looked at the various attitudes and perspectives of the different leaders in formulating the Treaty of Versailles. So now we'll actually look at the decided terms to see how the different attitudes and different desires of the leaders shaped the final outcome, and also how these different concerns and desires were balanced to form the best outcome for each and every nation. So the terms can be divided into 4 categories, and it can be divided into blame, money, disarmament, and territory. So first of all, we'll look at blame, which is also known as the War Guilt Clause. This was Article 231, and it basically meant that Germany and her allies would accept total responsibility for starting the war. This also meant that they would have to automatically assert the fact that they had to abide by all the terms as decided by the victorious allies in the Treaty of Versailles, because it meant that they accept that the war itself is all their fault, and they accept that they needed to accept any punishment that the allies felt was adequate. So this actually led to mass protests and demonstrations among the German public, because the German public could not accept that they had lost the war. It had looked to them as if their surrender was a deception by the loyal politicians. The common term used for them were November criminals. And this was because the German public was constantly reassured by their government throughout the course of the war that they were winning, and that they would be asserted as the victorious nation in the war. So the sudden assertion of them suddenly taking on the entire blame of the war as the losing nation seemed unacceptable to them. So this is why they all rose up in discontent, and this actually led to more and more protests, and such as the Munich Putsch, where Hitler actually, I don't know how to say this term, but debuted as a kind of social figure, political figure, and also there are a lot of other examples that you'll maybe want to look into by yourself after this lecture. And yeah, the second category we'll look at is reparations, so money. It was decided on £6,600 million, and which was a very harsh and very big figure at the time. And just to give you a bit of foreshadowing of how this big figure affected the events to follow, this figure would lead to the Ruhr crisis, where French and Belgian troops would invade the Ruhr, which is a very important industrial area of Germany at the time. And this was in response to a German failure to meet the date in which the reparations installment had to be paid. So the Ruhr, because it was a very big industrial area and a very important industrial area, this kind of crippled German economy a lot, and this devastated German standards of living, and it kind of gave them a very big sense of their need to pay the reparations. So this led to the German government just kept printing more and more money to overcome this crisis, which led to hyperinflation and more severe problems. This is also something that you might want to look back into. This is a very brief introduction of the event, but you might want to look into its implications and like the causes and just the severe the little details that you might want to write in your examination. And the third category to look at is disarmament. In terms of disarmament, the German army was limited to 100,000 men, conscription was banned, tanks, armored vehicles, and heavy artillery were banned, and the Navy was restricted to 6 battleships, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats without any submarines. And instead of being an independent state as France wanted, the Rhineland would be demilitarized instead, with an allied army of occupation for 15 years. This prevented the actual crippling of German economy to the extent that Britain had been concerned would not allow them to recover again, but it would still deprive them of a lot of control over a very important industrial area, and the allied nations because they would occupy the area, would also get a share of the territory as well. So this leads smoothly to their fourth category, which is territory. And this basically meant that Germany would lose all her colonies in Africa and the Far East, and it would be distributed to the victorious nations. And Alsace-Lorraine, as France wanted, would be returned to France. The Saar Basin, which is another territory that was pretty crucial to Germany at the time, would be administered by the League of Nations for 15 years, and then a plebiscite would decide its fate. So they would basically ask the people of the Saar Basin who they wanted to be governed by. And Anschluss, which is reunification, Austria was forbidden, and Danzig would become a free city administered by the League of Nations, with Poland using its port for external trade. This was kind of a win-win situation, as Poland, they wanted to become an independent state, but they also needed an overseas port, so Danzig deemed to be the very adequate territory to kind of give to them and to use for this method. So there was another term added that because the League of Nations was established as Wilson had wanted, Germany could not join the League of Nations until it had showed to be a peace-loving nation, but they still had to accept the covenant of the League. So all in all, it was deemed as very unjust and unfair to Germany in the whole. So as for the responses of the other nations, France was satisfied that the reparations were high and they felt that it was enough to kind of cripple Germany to the extent that they had wanted. And the Rhineland was demilitarized, although it hadn't been turned into an independent state exactly. Britain had, as I said, persuaded Clemenceau to kind of lose a lot of his ambitious and harsh demands for the treaty. So he was kind of just satisfied with the Rhineland becoming a demilitarized state. But they were unhappy that their ambition for an Anglo-American treaty of guarantee for France was rejected by the US. This basically meant that they wanted a treaty that would guarantee that the USA and Britain would kind of come to their rescue when Germany would invade, but the US Congress had rejected this, so this was not established, which was a factor of unhappiness of France from the outcomes of the treaty. As for the USA, they were satisfied that many terms in the 14 points, such as the establishment of the League of Nations, were included, and they were partially happy that the defeated powers had to disarm, because disarmament was one of Wilson's 14 terms, but it wasn't that all nations had to disarm as he wanted, but it was only the defeated nations, but still it was a step up from that kind of led Wilson closer to what he had wanted for the international community. But despite these terms being accepted by the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson still thought that the terms were too harsh on Germany, and more points in the 14 points were rejected than accepted, such as the free navigation of seas. So that was also kind of a factor that made USA unhappy with the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. And lastly, Britain. As I briefly mentioned before, Britain was the most satisfied among the big three, and this was because British colonies had been extended to an additional 1.8 million square miles, and he also felt that the treaty was harsh, but not too harsh that they would not be able to do business with Germany in the future. So it seemed by historians that Britain very cleverly and sufficiently balanced the two minds of Lloyd George very well, so that both outcomes could be reached with a very good outcome. And many consequences were actually stemmed from this treaty, especially domestically in Germany. As I mentioned before, the big reparation fee and the war guilt clause were unacceptable by the German public, and this led to mass protests and mass discontent. And although I did mention a few areas and a few events that kind of were the consequences in Germany due to the harsh terms of the treaty, I would recommend looking into these areas more closely to prepare for your exams. And I will put in some exam-style questions. Here are some exam-style questions that I think would be very good to try. It is on the areas that I've touched on in this lecture only. There are also a few more topics that you will want to look into, as I mentioned before, the German response to the Treaty of Versailles, and also kind of like the events that happened after that that were stemmed from this treaty. But still, these questions are a good way to kind of prepare for your exams and prepare for kind of a timed setting where you would have to write the 3 questions, ABC questions, in your exams. So I think if you want to have a go at these questions, please do. And this concludes this lecture, but if you have any questions or any inquiries or any recommendations or suggestions for further lectures, please let me know in the comments, and I'll get back to you via the We Learn to Share official YouTube accounts. And also, yeah, just in general, just look forward to any further lectures, not only by myself, but by the team of We Learn to Share in general. And yeah, I hope this lecture helped you in your preparation for GCSE History.